Hi, I'm Paul Sullenberger. In this video, we're going to cover the Shimano crank installation guidelines for a CeramicSpeed Bottom Bracket. CeramicSpeed Bottom Brackets for a 24mm Shimano crankset are either going to feature a 61805 bearing as a 25mm ID and an integrated dust cover, or a 24mm bearing that'll fit the crank directly through. With a 24mm bearing, you have a flat dust cover with a slight raised lip that sits towards the inner race of the bearing, designed to give low drag and no contact on the seal of the outer race or the edge of the cup. Starting in 2018, nearly all options have now moved over to the 61805 bearing. With the more robust design of the integrated dust cover, this helps prevent contamination and moisture from getting down inside the bearing, keeping the bearing performing at a high level and keeping it clean for longer. We'll now go ahead and sample installing this crank. The Shimano crank, we start with just a little bit of grease on the spindle to give a nice interface as it slides in. The grease also helps prevent moisture from getting in from the spindle and working its way inside. Just a fine little bead around the end to where when you install through the dust cover, that'll spread it out nicely. No spacers or anything are needed for the drive side. Go ahead, slide it through, and a nice snug fit. Make sure everything fits proper without creaking or noise issues. Now make sure the first side spins nice and freely. Now we'll go ahead and install the second side, and in most cases you should not need any additional spacers. We've seen with many of the 9100 cranks, one of the included 0.5mm dust covers going on in front of the dust seal and before the crank arm. Make sure there's adequate clearance behind the crank arm to the cup. It's always important that you check this before installing the chain and moving forward to make sure everything performs at a nice level without scratching or marring. Go ahead and install the preload nut. To Shimano spec, this goes for 0.7 to 1.5 Newton meters. It's a very light touch, and you should still be able to have a free spinning crank once you're tightened in. I like to tighten it a little more first, and then loosen it back up to make sure everything's fully seated. Check to see if there's any lateral play. You get a beautiful free spin, allowing the bearings to perform as they need without being over preloaded. Go ahead with a 5mm, apply the torque on the torque bolts, and this is between 12 and 14 Newton meters with the Shimano spec. And you also make sure that you have the little locking pin on the end of the crank engaged. That's kind of a safety net in case one of the bolts were to come loose or break. It keeps the crank arm from falling off. Your crank should spin quietly and freely. In the event that anything's dragging or a noise is occurring, go ahead and check each step to make sure there's clearance between the crank arm and the cup and that there's nothing dragging additional on the backside of the chain rings or the spider. This crank is now ready to go onto a bike.